Hey, everybody, welcome to Contra Talk. My name is Richard Henry, and this is the podcast where we talk about things that matter. And something that matters is missions. It matters to me. It matters probably to you since you clicked on this, but it's missions specifically in a hot button binary age, kind of all or nothing. You're either this or you're this. You can't be both or can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. So many people think this way, even in the church proper in America and the West. And certainly in media and higher education, this is just kind of a thing. If you love America, that means you hate everybody else, or if you love everybody else, I mean you have to hate America. And there's just such a strange time we live in. I'm talking to a friend, Alex Kocman. He is a husband and a father and director of communications and engagement at ABWE. It's a missionary organization similar to IMB and other sending organizations out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Great organization. Been around 100 years old. 1927 is when it started. They do a lot of great work internationally, church planting, schools, and much missionary work. A lot of, well, why don't you just watch the conversation and or hear the conversation, and you'll see what they do and some of the things of how we can relate to each other and the nations and what Christians should be thinking about, how we should be thinking about these things in our modern time. Enjoy it. Alex Kocman, welcome to the show, brother. How are you?
Good to have me. Wow, this is bad. Great.
It is good to have you.
Good to be here. How are you, brother? Yes, we're doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you have a podcast too, so it's, I'm sure you're
unbelievably based on my impeccable oratory. That's right. Yes, the Missions podcast. We've been doing that since 2017. Every Sunday night at 7 p.m.
Wow, every Sunday night at 7. That's great. I've only listened a couple times, but I know we've talked a number of times. And anyway, we're going to talk about missions, and it's something you write pretty regularly. You're very active in many different areas. I know you were at the Founders Conference. You spoke at the Founders Conference back in January this year, right? Is that right?
I'll be speaking next January.
Okay.
Yeah, very involved in that group. They've been wonderful to work with. I've got one book with Founders, Missions by the Book, co-written with Chad Vegas. He helped found Radius International, wonderful organization. And most recently, Striving for the Faith just came out last month on Philippians and what the missional life looks like. And we've got something else in the works, actually, in preparation for that 2026 event. I just signed a contract with Founders. We're working on a book that I don't know how much I'm allowed to share, but the idea, of course, I've still got to write it, but the idea is that it actually gets at some of the issues we're talking about here today. That intersection between missions and some of the older understandings of the order of loves and natural affections that are starting to come back into the conversation now. But where does that leave us with global missions, with our obligation to people who are different from us? And so really looking forward to that project. And Richard, as far as I'm concerned, this conversation is kind of greasing the skids for that in my own thinking. So appreciate the chance to talk about it.
Yeah, no, providential for sure. Good. No, that's really good. Well, people should check that out in a year or so when it's done, right? Well, I guess for the audience, for the sake, I know you work at ABWE up in Pennsylvania, been around a long, long time, missions organization, similar for SBC people, similar to the IMB. I was probably more or less, right?
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah. Functionally, I guess.
Yeah, we're a full-scale sending mission board for missionaries who may or may not be a part of the SBC. We work with SBC, but we work outside of the SBC as well. The main difference being we're not a part of the cooperative program, so our missionaries raise their own funds, but the same essential emphases in ministry. We send workers that are committed to evangelism, discipleship, church planting, training of qualified local men as elders and shepherds and people who can carry on the task of mission. We do that in about 91 countries. We have about 1,000 workers, and by God's grace, we've been going since 1927. So coming up on our 100th year anniversary.
Coming up on 100 years. Nice, brother.
So it's a glorious thing to be a part of a movement that is far bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. No, amen. All right. Yeah, we visited up there several years ago. Go check things out. Might still work with you guys at some point. I don't know. We'll see what the Lord has. But for now, You wrote an article, like I said, you write several. You write fairly broadly in different areas, including, of course, the ABWE website. And you wrote an article we'll look at in a second, but just kind of for context, as you mentioned, with nations, I know a lot of times people are talking about that more and more, right? The order of loves and all the rest. But just what does Matthew 28 really mean today? Or how do we
Sure.
understand this when, these are radically opposed faith traditions, or even violence and other things that really kind of, I guess, we have to consider, at least to some degree,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
at least we want to consider. And for the sake of the audience and everything, just how does ABWE biblically understand like what a nation is, and
Well, I think,
how
yeah,
does that really
no,
work?
that's a
Or
great
maybe
way of
just you,
starting
if
off
you
the
want to just
question.
use that.
Well, and I have my thoughts as well. I think starting with ABWE, we would define nation, I would say biblically, I would say in a way that's pretty unremarkable among missions organizations, missiologists. We look at, for instance, Matthew 28, obviously by no means the only place where the term ethne or ethnos is used,
Hmm.
but we look at ethnos there as referring not to what we see today as nation states, these massive monoliths encompassing multiple peoples. But we look at it the way missiologists view it as a constellation of different factors, which you can weigh differently. And there is some subjectivity here, but you know it when you see it. It's a people that's defined by language, defined by heritage, defined by self-conception, identity, defined certainly by culture. Religion is a part of that as well. The term that missiologists use the most is people group or ethno-linguistic people group. And we think that what's happening in the Great Commission is not only does Christ send his people all over the earth to proclaim Christ in each place, but that also Christ desires, one, that the gospel would be proclaimed among each distinct people in different languages, in different settings. Again, people marked by heritage, race, ethnicity, nationality, all of those sorts of hallmarks. But then I would even take it a step further, and I believe that the Lord wants to disciple. Obviously, that's the operative verb in the Great Commission, right? Wants to disciple each nation as such. Not only winning individuals. I think, yes, absolutely, the Great Commission is an individual soul winning mandate, but it's more than that.
Hmm.
Christ wants the obedience and has purchased the obedience of nations and groups as such. Not that everyone will be saved without exception, but
Hmm.
that there are corporate and collective and societal effects of the gospel. And here's the thing within ABWE, we've known this, and missiologists have known this for years. The modern definition of a people group, you go into really any Bible believing evangelical church, they've probably interacted with the idea of unreached people groups before. The whole
Hmm.
idea of an unreached people group is that among a particular ethno-linguistic people group, if there's less than 2% of the population that are professing evangelical believers in Christ, chances are that a gospel movement is unlikely to start and have the capacity to affect the whole of that population. Um, and there's the distinction that people make between near neighbor evangelism and cross-cultural missions. There's the belief that missiologists have that the gospel tends to spread most organically or most effectively or naturally. Ordinarily, obviously, the Lord can work in extraordinary ways, but ordinarily the gospel spreads among people speaking the same language, among
Hmm.
people that are a part of the same broader social unit in some way. And where the gospel has a harder time spreading is where there's a cultural leap that has to happen, a
Hmm.
linguistic one, a geographic one, etc. And so the idea of an ethno-linguistic people group is, okay, what is that unit then among which the gospel spreads most freely? Not that we need the New Testament age to go back just into history and know what a nation is. Obviously, nations pre-existed the Great Commission, but it's a
Hmm.
functional definition that's helpful. We want to look at that then and say, okay, so whatever a nation is, the gospel is meant to spread among this people group as such, the gospel affects not just individuals, but also peoples. And I'll stop rambling, but all of that to say, we've thought through these issues in the missions world for years before what is a nation became a politically heated point of discussion. And it
Mm.
seems to me now that the broader political, philosophical conversation is really just beginning to grasp onto some basic concepts that I think missiologists have been aware of for some time. And I think we need to connect the dots between our political theology, our missiology, our systematic theology. I think all of these are related. If we understand what God has built into the creation order and then what he expects us to do in the Great Commission, making disciples of these distinct peoples and nations.
Hey, it's me from the thing you're currently watching. I hope you're enjoying this. Alex has got a lot of great stuff. I hope you stay for the whole thing. If you are enjoying this, do like and subscribe it. Subscribe it, or subscribe to it. Drop a comment, say hello, things like that. Do the whole thing. I do appreciate that. Back to the show. Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, that kind of knocks out some of the first parts of this brief article. I'll share this for everybody in the description as well. But so I guess the big thing that kind of hangs up in my mind, and I've had some conversations recently where, especially with immigration here to America, and I just read a Theodore Roosevelt clip or quote earlier, or at least
Yeah.
attributed to him. And it was very much, you want to come here, great. You assimilate, you want to become American, you be an American, et cetera, et cetera. English is the language and so on. And I think that was probably unchallenged for a very long time until I'm not sure exactly when, but recently, I would say in the last 10 or 20 years, maybe more. But I guess the reverse of it is, and let me ask you this then, what do you say to people who are probably more on the left side or leaning that way, that, well, missions is just, you're trying to appropriate culture, you're trying to force your religion, you're trying to push your faith, those people are good the way they are, et cetera, et cetera. How do you answer those people who, again, immigration to here, but then we have missions outward going
Yeah.
to a place generally that's
Yeah.
generally different than like Western, fair-skinned Western
Right.
European people, American people, and so on. How do
I'm
you
glad
answer those
you
people?
No, and I'm glad you set up the question that way because it's a question that does come. And I think if we're only having these conversations among fellow evangelical or conservative or reformed believers, we're probably likely to forget that those objections exist. One of my
Right.
youth group students years ago, he aged out, he went off to college, and he shared with me later on that he was at an ostensibly Christian university. They've drifted, in my opinion, greatly. And he
Mhm.
shared that his history professor, upon hearing that this student had an interest in cross cultural missions, evangelism, church planting, dissuaded him, told him not to get into missions because it's just white European imperial colonialism. So even
Mhm.
within the mainstream church, mainline church, I should say, that's a real contention that we have to wrestle with. And then, of course, once in a while, these conversations leak out into the broader world. And I remember years ago there was a pretty discouraging situation where our friend Brooks Buser at Radius International, he had made some innocuous post about, hey, here's this remote tribal people group who's recently come to Christ, received access to the gospel. And
Mhm.
the secular left got a hold of that and really tried online to make him suffer for daring to impose his colonial religion on these remote peoples who are just
Mm.
fine the way that they are. We have to be
Mhm.
prepared to give an answer to that. On the one hand, I think playfully, I almost want to respond like, and so what if that's what this is? I mean, honestly, I think the person who's making that claim is not an honest interlocutor. I
Mhm.
don't know that the claim is always worth, giving the credence of really giving a detailed response and rebuttal. It's similar to when someone just screams, "Well, you're a racist." Like, well,
Right.
there are
Yeah.
things that get overused, and some of these terms have begun to lose their meaning the more that they get overused. In this case, we can look back in missions history. We can see, yeah, there was some mistakes made along the way, and certainly with the modern missions movement coming out of the mid 19th century, yeah, there were some ways where we would look at the way that missions efforts were maybe at times intertangled with other colonial colonizing efforts, that we would say, like, well, probably not the best vehicle for evangelism all the time. But
Mhm.
I think at the same time, it's easy for us to have that judgment. It's easy for us to engage in, what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, because we're not there. We take for granted this
Yeah.
global liberal order where everyone's free to believe what they want to believe. In reality, the global scene is constantly marked by conflict between peoples, and sometimes, in order for gospel workers to peaceably go into one context, means that another people group is ensuring, sometimes through strength and sometimes through conflict, that the conditions are there for political peace and stability, which
Mhm.
sometimes means exercising a heavy hand. I think we can recognize that the Lord used that, and we can also look back in missions history and see there are times when missionaries are opposed to the colonialist agenda, because there were exploitative impulses that were a part of the colonizing scheme. And missionaries like William Carey found himself disfavored by the East India Company, and
Mm.
actually opposed by these groups, and had to work against them and behind their back in order to evangelize people groups who, the reality is if you're evangelizing a people group, you're teaching them that they're made in the image of God, and you're bringing them into the fellowship of believers. You're planting churches, meaning they're no longer a people group that you can subjugate. They're your brothers and sisters in Christ now, part of the
Right.
invisible global
Yeah.
church. Well, that makes it difficult to take advantage of some of these people groups. And so, yeah, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about the history. I don't think we should concern ourselves with that critique. I think we should do what Christians have always done, which is introduce the gospel, also introduce the fruits of the gospel, which often
Mhm.
means that societies get better and they function in a more healthy way. Somebody wants to call that imperialism, they're welcome to. We know what
Right.
we're about. We know that that's not what this is. But the gospel does bear fruit, and it does change people's for the better.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, and it's something that, and I like saying it because it's true. Jesus is better, right? And so it's not just a matter of, well, they were fine the way they are or were. And it's like, yeah, according to your materialistic
Right.
Darwinism or whatever you believe, probably. But were they really? I mean, I don't know. I mean, if we're just going to be pragmatists for a second, like, is it better to have like running clean water and sanitation and lights, in a clean bed that's not riddled with fleas or lice or worms or any other number of like just practical things that leftists or progressives or whatever are very much about, right? Helping this and, the orphan and the widow and this very functional hands-on ministry, especially if they're a professing Christian in some capacity.
Right.
But at the same time, they talk out of both sides of their mouth. Maybe not everybody, of course, it's a generalization, but those types of people do that, right? And it's just like, well, you can't have it both ways, sweetheart. Like it's
Right.
either this and then these things, or it's neither, right? And of course, if you're going to say uh, these people are made in God's image because they are, and we are, and there are certain people. Not everybody's a hand, not everybody's an eye, not everybody's a feet,
Mhm.
ears, nose, etc. There are certain roles and demographic or dynamics for the church, for men and women to go out and do the things that the church has always done.
Mhm.
And one of those main things is missions, right? Not everybody can be a missionary. Some people, as the old adage is, it's holding the rope, right? And they're doing those things and supporting and helping. But yeah, the whole imperialism, I mean, no doubt that did happen. But like you said, chronological snobbery, which is such a great phrase, is so true. And I mean, how many people are going to look back, our great grandchildren at us, after all this global warming stuff shakes out? And it's like, did they really believe this? I mean, nobody seems to believe it. They're buying, seaside mansions and they're flying around on massive jets, dumping fuel into the air. and yet they're going to ridicule people or lecture us normal people. And it's like, you don't actually believe, the cataclysm of global warming or climate change or whatever. Maybe it's going to happen. Maybe it'll all be hot and we'll all be underwater. I don't know. Probably not. But it's easy to look at people like you're saying. I'm not going on a tangent, but to look back and say, "Oh, that was bad. You shouldn't have done that." Because how many things are we doing right now that it's like, I don't know. What's the verdict of history going to be on this generation? Not good, especially if you're going to look at 2020. But that's another show. So just kind of back to this article for a second, a bit more. So you said, and this is the opposite, right? Some people say a nation is just a set of propositions rooted in notions of egalitarianism or individual autonomy, but ideas alone cannot declare independence, write constitutions, or expand territory. People do. And that's, that kind of goes to the adage, corporations aren't people, where generally people on the left scream about corporate tax cuts or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but corporations aren't anything without people, right? Like anything. A family's not anything without people. A business isn't anything without people. The church isn't anything without people. And so, yeah, I thought that was just really helpful.
Well, and you heard it in the last election cycle, this idea that America is an idea. That's what we're referring to when we say the propositional nation. And I do think we can be honest and say, yes, there are some very unique ideas that are active and working in and around the American founding. I don't think those ideas came out of nowhere. I think those ideas come out of a rich tapestry of Anglo-Protestant political theory, from the reformers with a line through John Locke, with a line through Blackstone. And even though some of those concepts were secularized, you don't get the political theory and the theories of equality and liberty and ordered liberty. You don't get that without the Protestant Reformation. You don't get that without Magna Carta. There's some unique ideas that are operating, but it's people with ideas, and it's a particular people in a time and place who were not so much sort of calling down from some abstract realm somewhere down, almost summoning an incarnation or an apparition of these abstract ideals that just were always floating throughout the universe, and it just suddenly takes up residence in what became the United States. Rather, they were operating out of what they had received, their tradition, their heritage. And I think that's important for us as well now, because look, the idea that America is merely a nation, that America is merely an idea, I think we all know that idea is dead upon arrival. It clearly is more than an idea. And we would say it's not just a people, it's also distinct peoples. Obviously, we can look at American blacks and say, okay, they've always been a part of the American story. So what this is not is not saying America is only one race or is only one cultural expression. America has always been sort of a patchwork quilt, but it's something particular. And there are particular ideas and cultures. For instance, America has historically been, if it's anything, religiously, it's a Protestant nation. It's never been, for instance, a Hindu nation or a Roman Catholic nation. And to pretend otherwise is really just not doing honest history. We find ourselves, though, when we trade off on these ideas, when we say, well, really all that's necessary to be American is to assent to kind of these abstract, universalized, liberal ideas of equality, egalitarianism. And when we say that assenting to those is all that it means to be an American, you've effectively sold the farm at that point. Anyone can be an American. And it breaks down in this way. What if I'm an American citizen and I disagree with those ideas of universal egalitarianism? Does that make me still an American? Well, it does. Okay, well, then to be an American means more than just assenting to certain ideas. And ideas, as we know, have consequences as well, from Richard Weaver. And so what are the consequences of leveling everything and reducing the American experience to just these abstract ideals? Well, I think part of it is that we forget we exist as a people or as multiple peoples inside of a nation state in a particular place and time. And for us as Christians, we're called to make disciples of other particular nations and people groups in space and time. We're also called to disciple our own nation, our own people, which means not
Hmm.
just individual evangelism, it also means there's broader cultural ramifications as the gospel is embraced and believed in the lordship of Christ is played out publicly in all of life. We can't do that if we think that we're just sort of floating along in this abstract system. And that's really where you get the thinking that doesn't place any emphasis on bringing the gospel to nations or even on winning individual souls, because at that point, each person is their own completely autonomous decision maker. And we've really lost
Hmm.
the plot of what Christ calls us to be about in this world.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So the point, and I guess obviously you look scripturally, there's not a ton, even in something like this, regarding nations, races. I know some people still like to use that. I don't prefer that term just because it's often rooted in Darwinism.
Right.
And there aren't different races of people. There's just people, right? There's different ethnicities, different people groups with different skin tones and
Yeah.
languages and things. They prefer different foods, dress differently, etc. Um,
And I would say yes and
but
no. I mean, I'm sympathetic to those who would say like, well, when we say races, we know what we mean. Not in the evolutionary sense. Obviously,
yeah,
there aren't fully separate tracks of human descent. We would say, yeah, absolutely, we're
right.
one race, one blood, in that biblical sense. There are obviously groupings of people based on characteristics, attributes, some things that are a result of environment. You look at skin pigmentation, and those things certainly group themselves. And then within that,
Hmm.
there's nationalities and ethnicities as you drill down deeper and deeper. I think we can acknowledge that there's real differences between peoples. I think that's one thing that's maybe been helpful over the last few years. We certainly can't pretend there aren't differences between groups of people. There are.
Right.
But to your point, that doesn't mean that those have to figure into the way that we treat everyone in such a way as to show partiality, which James explicitly forbids us to show
Right.
partiality.
Yeah. No, it's true. Very true. Yeah. I guess the thing that, I mean, even for my own self and going back 20 years in my BC days, like I still remember thinking like, okay, there's black or African American and white or Caucasian, but then there's Asian, but like not yellow, like that used to be red and yellow, black and white, right? That little Sunday school song. Well, we don't use those terms, but we still use these terms. And then it's like, well, who's Asian? Like not Indians, although India or Russia, and Russia is in Asia, and so is India, but those aren't Asians. It's like really just Chinese and maybe Japanese, or maybe I don't know, Vietnamese, and so like it just gets so muddled. And I remember thinking that as like 20-year-old or whatever, and professing ish Christian, but I wasn't a believer. I wasn't trusting Christ,
Mm.
but I would have said I was, right? But there's just such a cultural thing that just kind of, I don't know, it almost like floats, and it's just we all like more or less assent to it, and it shifts whether you watch the news, whether you're on social media, whether you're watching certain award shows, Hollywood, any of these things in institutions, colleges. It's weird, and it's like I don't know how. I guess I'll ask just kind of from a mission standpoint. And again, I know you're not just a missions guy, although that's where you work and predominantly a lot of your time. But how should Christians really think about those things in general? Because I mean, again, it's like broad question, sorry, but like with okay, there's all just one people, right? One race, one blood, like you said. Um, but there are distinctions within people, right? And whether that's Americans, in deep South Georgia or up in Maine or anywhere in between, all around the globe, there are distinctions. What I don't know even know what I'm trying to
Yeah.
ask. It's just, um, it- I guess I mean, what's the average when those conversations come up with you, which you probably do have them in time to time
Yeah.
with Christians at church or online or whatever.
Yeah.
How really should we interact with other people? I mean, do we have to have a quota? I mean, I was talking with somebody at our community group last night. The church that I'm a part of now several years ago was, kind of had a heart for this even before George Floyd stuff. and was like, oh, we need more black people type of thing without saying that. And you're like, but what? Like, I don't understand. Like, why? I guess, but what do you mean? Like, what? I don't know. No, I'm just rambling. What you have any
No,
response to that?
yeah, I mean, you're putting your finger at what has really rent the reformed world asunder
Yeah.
for the
Oh yeah.
past, I don't know, 10 years, really. I think you could say the first social justice wars, which were over CRT, wokeness, and then since then, and then COVID and the aftermath, now the battle lines have shifted in a way that's more sneaky, harder to define and pin down, because the previous debate several years ago over things like social justice, wokeness, CRT, essentially pit a right leaning and a left leaning response to racial issues against each other. One was to favor more collective action. One was to look at redressing historic wrongs, and we joke about quotas, but that was a part of it. Or affirmative action was a big piece of that agenda. And then over here, you had more of the approach on the right to say, race is a construct, meritocracy should be favored, judge people as individuals. Both of those, though, really came from a left centered, some would say post-war, but came from a liberal understanding of those issues fundamentally. Now the debate has shifted to where the conversation is, okay, have we just in general, with regard to nationality, ethnicity, have we imbibed too many modern assumptions in general about those categories? Do we need to return to pre-modern understandings of nationhood, family, and really just even defining what is the political? And I think what's made the current fight so contentious is the tendency that we have as evangelicals to accept simple, pat answers with Bible verses on almost any issue.
Right.
So the issue of ethnicity, nationality, race comes up, for instance, and we're quick to trot out our, well, in Christ there is no Jew or Greek or barbarian or Scythian or slave or free or Gentile or Jew, as rightly we should. That verse and verses like it in Galatians, Colossians, that has a place within our biblical theology of nations. But is it our starting point? Because you really have to do biblical theology. You really have to go with the order of revelation. When there's issues between men and women, we don't instantly trot out with just, well, in Christ, there's no male or female. Well, no, but also in Christ.
The liberals do for female pastors.
Exactly right. Yeah. And because we don't embrace the lie of transgenderism, we know, yes, at the foot of the cross, the ground is level. But in the real world, and especially this side of glory, we do have to contend with the real differences that these things result in as well. So I think what we need to do is recover a classical, an older, you could say a pre-modern understanding of the interplay of nature and grace. And I am someone who's very in favor of saying that the grace does not negate nature. It redeems nature, but it doesn't swallow up nature. It restores nature.
Yeah. Okay.
For me as a Christian man, when I embrace Christ and turn from my masculine types of sins, there's masculine sins, there's feminine sins. When I turn from my sins, which are particular to me as a man with my temptations, I don't become a sexless, asexual being. I become a Christian man. Grace restores my masculine nature. Now I can take that nature as a man and use that for the glory of God. And likewise, I think we can look at nationality. Granted, it's not as innate as sex. Sex is about as innate as it gets. Nationality is not quite so innate. It's something that develops in history. It's something that develops especially out of the Tower of Babel. But we can do biblical theology, and we can see that nations do matter to God. The diversity of nations is beautiful to God. He created it. He intended it. I think we would have ended up with some amount of ethnic diversity even without Babel, even if Adam hadn't fallen, because as people spread all over the globe and grouped together, just because of the environment and the terrain and distance between communication, you would have had natural differentiation that happened in the human gene pool, and that would have been a good and beautiful thing. And we can go to the end of the book in Revelation 5 and 7 and see that around the throne of the Lamb there's gathered every nation, tribe, and tongue. And those nations retain their distinctness in some way in the eschaton, which tells me that their distinctness is not purely a result of the sin at Babel, and that God actually keeps that the distinctness of their language and maybe even their physical traits at some level. Again, we get resurrected bodies, that those are beautiful things that God wants to retain ultimately. So then the question becomes, okay, how does grace restore what it means to be a man, what it means to be a Kocman for me, what it means to be a Pennsylvanian, what it means to be an American, what it means to be someone of European descent, and certainly what it means to be a Christian and a follower of Christ. And we can look at how grace is to restore and to make whole all of those different aspects of our identities. For instance, the wrong way to belong to your ethnicity is to hate everyone outside of your ethnicity. But the right way to belong to your ethnicity is to seek to reach all of your people group with the gospel. This is what we do. And to bring it full circle with missions, this is what we do with unreached people groups on the field. If we send a missionary to the Fulani people group, we don't say, now you're in Christ, now your ethno-linguistic identity no longer matters. We don't say that. We say, because you're Fulani, you're a part of the universal body of Christ, and welcome into the family. We love you. You're our brother. You also have a particular obligation because of your proximity, your linguistic affinity. You have an obligation to your fellow Fulani to bring the gospel to them as near neighbors, to disciple them, to be salt and light among the Fulani in ways that we can't as English-speaking Americans, missionaries, for instance. So in the same way, the right way to belong to your ethnicity is not to hate and reject everyone outside of it. The right way to belong to it is to seek to bring the blessings of Christ to those who are in your family tree, which is what nations are. They're just extrapolated. You have families, households that multiple households compose a clan, multiple clans compose a tribe, multiple tribes compose a nation. That's at least the progression that you see in the Old Testament. So again, I think the right mode of thought, and I'm sorry to ramble on, but I think the right mode of thought, how does grace not subsume nature, but how does it restore nature? How can we live as embodied people in a way that's consistent with the gospel, consistent with the Christian faith, which does level those distinctions? God's not a respecter of persons. Bigotry doesn't play into it at all. But we can do so in a way while celebrating and honoring differences and seeing the hand of God at work in those things. Even as we enjoy fellowship together as Christians reconciled through the one way, Christ.
Yeah. Would you say, and obviously this is somewhat anecdotal, but would you say then, obviously, I mean, there's all sorts of racism and hatred, ethnic hatred in all directions, right? It's clearly not just white people hating black people. Like that's like the classic one, but anybody can be racist, right? Anybody can prefer, which I would, of course, define it for our modern audiences, not just someone who has a slight disagreement than me or disagrees with somebody who doesn't look like them, but someone who has animus towards someone else who doesn't look like them, they don't speak the same language, or certainly different melanin content, etc. It's like, you're just disgusting because of who you are. Like, that's racism. And that in and of itself is a wicked sin. And obviously the Bible condemns that. And any Christian who supports that is sinning, right? But there are preferential things, like you've even said a moment ago I saw it in Southern Seminary, and usually it was immigrant, Chinese or Japanese or Indian or whatever. And there's definitely a language cohesion, but people would self-segregate all the time. And it's like, somehow we're told, by the ethos of the culture, this is bad, you can't do that, but this is totally fine over here. And it's such a weird, I don't know. I mean, you have any thoughts on that as far as just in general or missions related? Like, self-segregation versus, because again, we're not just amorphous blobs,
Right.
asexual bots that
Well,
are all the same. Go
you're
ahead.
observing a real phenomenon. I mean, on the one hand, I think we should say, well, okay, look at it this way. In our church, we have multiple subcultures represented.
Yeah.
We have African Americans, we have Hispanics. We did not go out seeking them. The beauty of the gospel is that when the word is rightly preached and applied, people respond to that regardless of their background. So we didn't set out to have an explicitly multi-ethnic church, but to some small degree, it happened organically because of the grace of God at work in
Mm-hmm.
people's lives. I think that's beautiful. At the same time, there's a Korean church down the street in our city, a couple of miles away from ours. That's okay. We're
Yeah.
very okay with it. Yeah, language is
Yeah.
part of it as well. Obviously, you need to be able to worship in a language that you understand. Our God is not a God of disorder or confusion, but of
Mm-hmm.
order and understanding. So I think that factors in as well. Um, I think one thing that's important for our purposes is, I don't think that the differences between the different ethnicities, or let's just say skin shades in our congregation, they don't represent massive cultural chasms. In some
Mm-hmm.
ways, they do. Um, One of my fellow elders who happens to be African American, yeah, him and I have had different upbringings and different experiences, even growing up in a similar geographic area. Both of us grew up in Philly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but we speak the same language. We can unify over that. I think in our churches, what we have to do is seek fellowship in such a way that avoids unnecessary division. And if I
Mm-hmm.
could caution people on the right who are starting to think in different ways about nationality, it would be um, a certain degree of natural self-segregation, like you're talking about, does naturally happen. Okay, my child who's Caucasian is going to be more naturally probably attracted to other Caucasians. Like that's, as far as finding a romantic partner, like that probably happens naturally. That happens certainly among Blacks or Hispanics or Asians. Not always, but
Mm-hmm.
that tends to happen. I think where we have to be careful is in our churches, are we artificially lifting up barriers and differences between people and making absolute something that happens, but in a subjective and inconsistent way. People
Mm-hmm.
naturally sort themselves. Yes, that doesn't mean that people must always sort themselves and cannot mix and should be separated from one another, right? And that's where
Yeah.
you see extremes and you see excesses, and there are some real nefarious individuals on the internet who are guilty of ethnic and nationalistic vainglory and pride. And I think we need to
Yeah.
police our own ranks as Christians or as people on the right in particular, and call those things out. But that doesn't mean that it's bad the way that people do naturally tend to show favor towards people that are like them.
Mm-hmm.
We just had St. Patrick's Day here a few weeks ago. My wife has more Irish heritage. I don't think I have any. I think I have some Scots Irish.
Yeah.
Not the same thing at all. Just ask them, right?
Right.
And it's kind of funny. We've got one redhead in the church. She always wears green, on Sunday near to March 17th. And in some of those ways, like, yeah, there's something fun about recognizing your heritage and your culture. And
Yeah.
I don't think that Europeans should be the only people unable to recognize that. I don't think we should have a system where you can't recognize that. We can only recognize these other ethnic groups. No, you can celebrate your Irish heritage. You can celebrate your
Right.
American heritage and identity, and that's a glorious thing. Being American is something distinct, especially if your family's been here for many generations. And I think we hamper ourselves when, on the one hand, to tie some things together, on the one hand, we tell missionaries, go to this particular ethno-linguistic people group, learn their language, love their heritage, love their culture, try to assimilate in some way so that you can be an incarnated gospel witness. We say that to them, but then in
Yeah.
the States we say, you can't love your own. Your nation is just an idea. Your people aren't a
Mm,
real people. You're just an economic zone. I think there's a contradiction between those two things. I think if we can love these faraway peoples for what they are, with their heritage, their culture, and their identity, I think we can do the same thing at home. And I think we can trust the gospel and the imperatives of Christian love to stop either one of these things from turning into favoritism or partiality or vainglory. I think.
yeah.
I think.
No, it's a good. It's a great concept or a great idea, and I think some of that is already playing out in some regards. Would you say then? And I think I meant to ask this earlier, but that some of this is because of just kind of a self animus, a self hatred that's been imposed, or at least strongly encouraged by people who look like us, like, well, white people don't have a culture, we don't, you don't have that, you can't, blah blah blah. Or I mean, you look at Europe, right? We got France, we got UK, we've got places in Ireland and many other places in Europe where it was just Ramadan not that long ago,
Yeah.
and Muslims are praying, and it's so forced. I can see it from a distance through my phone, and it just seems really forced, very very partial, especially with the police and leaders, presidents, prime ministers, whatever. And yet Christians pray in front of an abortion clinic or just street preaching, and they get arrested or they get
Sure.
talked to, addressing down from the cops. And it's like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Would you say though that's been happening, at least in part, in the West, especially in America? Like, you shouldn't be happy.
Absolutely. In the West, Jeremy Carl wrote The Unprotected Class, and
Yeah.
he said that the thing that's unique, let's say, for instance, about whites compared to any other ethnic or racial group, is that they are their own in-groups out-group. And I think that's true. I think we have such a tortured conscience for good reason, because of past historic abuses. But I do think that there is an agenda to play up those concerns in such a way that ultimately, I think the object is to separate everyone, not just whites or European descent or Americans. I think there is an agenda to ultimately uproot people of all nationalities in all places, from land, from heritage, from history, from culture, and from religion. Because I ultimately think it's the religion of secular humanism tied up in this globalistic scheme where really we get to invent ourselves. We can be whoever we aspire to be. It's that Babel instinct. It's that hideous strength playing out in real time. It's the sinful desire to self-invent, to self-actualize, and to project this out into the universe, to be as God. And I think we would all do well, African American or Black, white, Caucasian, Asian, and that's just America and its diversity of peoples. Every people group in all of our nations, I think we would do well to realize our identity is not constructed; it's received, it's given by God as a part of nature. The fact that I'm male, the fact that I was born here in America, the fact that I had the privilege of growing up in a Christian household and hearing the gospel from a young age, the fact that I have parents and grandparents of German, of Czechoslovakian, of Italian, and of Scots-Irish origin, and that all of those things figure into who I am today. That I can't hate my own people, because that's not honoring the fifth commandment. And whatever I recognize about the mistakes my ancestors made, I also recognize my descendants are going to feel a certain way about the mistakes that I'm probably making right now. And so I have to honor my fathers, who are alive and who aren't alive, right? Whatever I make of the history. And so, but recognizing that our identity is received as gift, and therefore it's mine to steward for the glory of God and for the good of others, and to express in love for neighbor. We don't invent ourselves. We receive ourselves from God. It's when I see my nature as given that then I'm in the position to surrender it back to God open-handedly and ask him to use it. If I construct it, then it's mine to glory in. And that's not what God has called us to.
Well, you answered my question without me asking it. I was going to give you the last word and any closing thoughts, but that's that's what you were going to say because I was going to ask that, but you already said it. So that's good, brother. I appreciate that. Do you have any other things you want to add before we land this plane?
No, brother, I mean, I would say we all need to exercise discernment right now.
Yeah.
We need to recognize, yeah, there's some older historic ideas that we need to engage with. There's also bad actors on both sides of the issue, of all sorts of backgrounds. We need to have our Bibles open. We need to have our church history textbooks open. We need to be anchored in real communities, not just floating around in online spaces, engaging with the edgiest and most biting remarks. We need to be in churches, which any church is going to have a lot of people that look like you and act like you, and any church is going to have several people that aren't like you, and you have
Hmm.
to learn how to love anyway. Your family has people that aren't like you and who are like you, and you have to learn to love them all anyway. Let's not just talk about the order of loves. Let's practice love, um, and let's do so with an eye towards how does the grace of God equip us to live out our callings in each of our particular places. Yeah, with my family, with my town, with my
Hmm.
nation, and then the ends of the earth. Here's the beauty of it. I can love my nation and my people, and I can love the nations, and I can go and be sent as a missionary or hold the rope for missionaries. We don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater or do one thing to the exclusion of the other. If we're doing all of this before God, recognizing what He's done in creation and in redemption to arrange and distribute the nations and peoples in the way that Acts 17 describes, then we can love the way He's called us to love, and we can do His will in the world. So but we need discernment. We need to think through these things carefully right now, and biblically.
Yeah, it's good, brother. Alex Kocman, appreciate the time. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for having me on, brother.
Yeah, God bless. See ya. Hope you enjoyed that. That's I hope it was helpful. Kind of all over the place. Certainly, at least me in the middle. I still kind of have my question. No fault on Alex, but it's hard to think about these things, right? Ethnicity and culture, and what does it really even mean to be American, right? Versus somebody might know what it means to be Japanese, or Indian, or South African even. But being an American it's maybe it's just I'm confused. Maybe you're confused too. I don't know, but thanks for sticking around, watching this, listening, and really just hearing Alex's heart, and just someone who's written about these things, who's worked in missions for several years at an organization that really cares about it, isn't just doing aid only, humanitarian aid, and not only just preaching the gospel or only, right? But there's this both and, the right and the left hand, as it were, and also doing things that are like, so you said, the Fulani people, something that we have a light-skinned guy from Ireland going to the Fulani people, right? Or an Indian going to Canada or whatever, right? And sometimes it's better to you have this engagement with somebody who looks like you and speaks the language and so on. So anyway, it was a good conversation. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed it too. And if you want to watch more, feel free. There's got one of these little buttons here. Click one of those. Drop a comment, say hello. I'm curious if you have any suggestions on topics, people to talk to, etc. I'm always open for suggestions. You can email that rthco@protonmail.com. rthco@protonmail.com. That's the easiest way to do that. And that's all. Y'all take care. God bless. Keep talking about things that matter. We'll see ya.